Welcome to the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. Each week, we talk with accomplished content strategy experts to share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. And now here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 19 of the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. I've got with us today Anika Anand. She's one of the co-founders of the Evergrey, a new kind of newspaper, a new kind of news publication based here in Seattle, Washington. And before that, Anika was at the Seattle Times. She was the education lab kind of out engagement editor there. She also worked at a nonprofit called Chalkbeat that does educational reporting and did some really interesting roles there. But let me have Anika talk a little bit more about her background and how she got into this world.
Yeah. So first, thanks for having me. This is great. This is my first Zoom podcast interview. I think it's brilliant. I started off as a reporter, a K-12 education reporter for what was then called Gotham Schools, which was the first site of Chalkbeat. And then soon after became the engagement director for Chalkbeat. So what we did was we had different cities across the U.S. that were covering K-12 education locally. And then we had the centralized team of people helping those reporters on the ground and really supporting their work. And so I'm kind of in a similar role now. So went from Chalkbeat to the Seattle Times briefly, and then decided to start the Evergrey with Monica Guzman about a little over a year ago in Seattle. And so
it's actually a year and a half. I went back and checked before we looked, not to alarm you.
Crazy. Yeah. It's just like it feels like we just celebrated our year anniversary, but it's already March. It's crazy. And so she and I really started the Evergrey together as co-founders, writing the newsletter every day, experimenting with social, experimenting with different content. And then we shifted roles a little bit more recently, probably in the last 3 or 4 months or so. So the Evergrey is part of a company called Whereby Us, which is the parent company, and they started something similar in Miami a few years ago, about 2.5 years ago, I think, called The New Tropic, which is just a sister publication of the Evergrey doing very similar things out in Miami. And they had a lot of success with what they were seeing, which is why they decided, okay, let's expand to new cities and see if this can work in other places. So Monica is now running the day-to-day of the newsletter and social and partnerships in Seattle, and I'm working as the storytelling director for Whereby Us. So what that means is my job is overseeing our editorial strategy across all 4 of our cities, soon to be 4 cities, I should say. We're just launching 2 new cities in the next couple of weeks, which is really exciting. And really thinking about how we can do storytelling in a really distributed way across platforms and in really creative ways that emphasize more reader engagement and not just sorry, that was a call that came through. In creative ways that emphasize reader engagement and not just content sharing. So that's part of the goal with my job.
Right, because I kind of backed into the whole thing just with the Evergrey as a publication, and your tagline "Live like you live here" really hints at that engagement, and so that's like a core strategy across all of Whereby Us as properties. So that's really interesting. So I want to run a hypothesis by you real quick, because you have a very super clear business vision, I guess I want to talk a little bit more about your business intent, like how you guys going to make money. And that's always been a challenge for any kind of publisher or journalist. So I want to get to that as well. But I also want to just run this idea by you that my hunch, I think you're the 3rd or 4th journalist I've interviewed as part of this podcast now. And a lot of the stuff I talk about, or a lot of the concepts out of the world of content strategy, my hunch is that journalists have been so immersed in 90% of this stuff their whole careers that it's like a fish swimming in water. You don't even think about it. It's just native to you. But I'm wondering, you've been in a couple of roles, like those director level roles in engagement and outreach, and now your work across a number of publications with Whereby US. Tell me a little bit about, what do you think of my hypothesis? And have you jumped out of the water at all to look down in a kind of as a content strategist back at this journalistic world you're navigating?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because when I think you first approached me about talking on this, I was like, content strategist, what is that exactly? You know? And it's not surprising to see a lot of journalists move from roles of daily reporting into content strategy roles at marketing firms and or PR houses or whatever it is. So there's definitely a lot of overlap. I think where I often feel like a fish out of water and not so comfortable with content strategy is as journalists and as reporters, we're, at least traditionally the way we were trained was really just to go out, interview, at least 3 people to get the story, write it up, publish it, and push it out. But there's so much more to content these days. And I even hate the word content sometimes because it doesn't fully encapsulate everything we're trying to do, which to me is really help our users learn and experience something new, right, in their cities. That's what we're trying to do with the Evergrey. And sometimes that's done through written content. Sometimes it's done through GIFs embedded in a Facebook post. Sometimes it's done through live events. And I think of all of that as part of our editorial strategy. So whenever it comes to like writing a piece of, written text and putting a photo on it and pushing it out, like, sure, great, yes, I'm a fish in water. Everything else, no idea what I'm doing. Constantly trying to experiment and iterate so that we're getting the highest engagement with what we're putting out there to folks.
Well, I guess what you just said, that's very very modern, in the way like UX people or startup people would approach anything. Very iterative, very evidence-based, a lot of like old school journalism was just like you said, just crank the story out, get 2 or 3 reporters on it, pull the story together, get it out. I talked to I don't know if you know Peter Herford. He's a local long retired from CBS News, but talking to him, he, not in our interview but in a personal conversation, he kind of rude the way that some things get lost in that process. That like the first draft of history can be really messy. It was kind of how he put it, I think. And so was your approach to this community-based, iterative, engaging sort of approach? Was that a reaction against that, or just sort of like, nah, that's just how it should be done? Where did that come from, I guess?
I think for me personally, it felt like, okay, we put the story out, now what? So what? What did I achieve with this? What impact has it had, right? And in so many cases, I just didn't really know because we weren't measuring it in the right ways, but B, it just became another piece of flyby content for people to consume on yet another platform that they're being inundated, with all these other things going on. So for me, it was also just a question of like, as there's a journalist who is amazing at engagement stuff named Joy Mayer. She taught for a long time. She's now an engagement consultant out in Florida. She always asks this question, what can I do with this, right? And so that's something that I try to ask of all the things that we make is, when this ends up in front of one of our users, what are they going to do with it besides just read it, right? Do we want them to share it with someone and get a conversation started about something? Do we want them to, take it down to take whatever we created down to the local city council and wag their finger at people? I don't know, whatever it is, right? Like, what do we want people to do with what we're making? And when you think about it, when you think about the intended impact in terms of actions, it gets to a lot more creative work. So,
Well, what the way you just contextualized that at the start, I think you used the term flyby content, and that's but then to flip that and make it into much more purposeful content, that's sort of, that to my mind is one of the foundations of content strategy, is that going from, and I think that maybe journalism as a profession was just kind of not in a rut, but sort of so dedicated to their mission that they didn't have the chance to come up and think about like, wait a minute, yeah, we did our job, we got the news out there, but how is this, how does it manifest, once it's just flown by the reader. You mentioned in there earlier also, you said measurement was one of the keys to this. How do you measure your success on this path towards more engagement?
This is like one of my favorite questions to nerd out about, mostly because I don't know the right answer. And I don't know that there is one right answer for any particular organization. I think every organization has to look at, excuse me, what they are producing to then figure out how to measure the impact. I don't think it's a one size fits all. And I think we've seen the pushback around that with page views, for example. The way that I try to think about impact is falling into two different categories. So qualitative and quantitative impact. The quantitative stuff is certainly, time spent, shares, on social, number of comments, those sort of things. And then the qualitative stuff is the stuff I get really excited about. And that's just feedback from users. It's the informed actions, again, that people take with your content. It's all of those things that are much harder to measure automatically, or on, in a super clear, succinct way. But, it's incredible. Like when I see the number, if a piece of content has performed really well and I see the number, I'm like, oh, that's cool. If I get an email from a reader who's like, this was so amazing, thank you so much for doing this. I shared it with my entire, school team, and they shared it with other people. I'm like, oh, that's awesome, And so I personally value those qualitative impacts so much more. And part of what I want to push for in my career is being able to bring those impacts and use them as a business case for the clients and for the companies who want to connect with us, through our brand and pay us money to be able to reach the audiences they want to reach. So really trying to talk to those businesses and brands about the value of qualitative impacts, not necessarily over quantitative, but just how they are just important as some of the harder numbers that they've traditionally got.
Right. The story isn't finished until you look at both the quantitative and the qualitative. No, I totally hear you there. And just, I want to interject something here for people who don't live in Seattle or who don't yet subscribe to the Evergrey, that every edition, every you're just constantly looking for opportunities to interact. So it's not like a fishing expedition. It's genuine and desire to engage with people. So you must have a ton of that. How have you, like, a lot of people like in the UX world are trained as ethnographers or, a similar kind of a profession like that. How have you learned to take those interactions and the interviews and the feedback and all that and sort of like put it in a story that, because you're convincing advertisers to buy stuff or you're convincing people of things, so you have to tell a persuasive story. How do you craft that qualitative story?
Yeah. One thing that we're experimenting with right now is just a really basic rudimentary impact tracker. When I was at Chalkbeat, we had built something similar as a WordPress plugin where basically once a story had been published, we could go back into the back end of that post in WordPress and add any qualitative impacts we were getting from people. So it would just require typing the things up and saving it there. And then it was particularly useful for us there because we were a nonprofit, and anytime it came to end of year grant reporting or talking to funders, we would just pull up that big list and be like, oh, this story did this and this story did this, and it was just a more organized way of tracking those things. We're trying to do a similar version of that right now. It's still slow goings because there's just so much that we hear from people every day, and so we're trying to figure out like what's really worthy of putting in. We're not going to put in every single retweet that we get, but what is the kind of stuff that feels most substantial? And so we use Airtable right now as a project management tool, which is amazing. I'm so in love with it. So we're using it for all of our editorial work right now, just like editorial calendar kind of stuff, story ideas. We actually just built a CRM out of it too, so that we're collecting all the interactions and reader names we have, and we keep all of those in one place so we can sort at any given time. I need to talk to this person about this topic. Let me search it. Here it is. And alongside that as well, we've built this really simple impact tracker where we can just add in stuff and over time refer back to it and see what we've done. So that's one thing we're trying to do, and then we're trying to use those stories that we put in there over time to make the case to potential clients or business partners that they should work with us.
Right. I'm big in the WordPress world, so I'm really curious about that plugin. I haven't come across that one before. Is that in the WordPress repo in the plugin directory?
Yeah, I don't
You know?
know. So I know that they have open sourced it since I left. It's called Mori, so measures of our reporting's influence, I believe is what it stood for.
Something like, okay, I'll go look for that.
So
Yeah.
I'll give you the link to it. But it was this was like 3 or 4 years ago that we started working on that project. So it felt like a pretty big deal at the time, something new. And now we're seeing a lot more impact tracking tools come out, and it's exciting because it means that there's more of a conversation going on about, the value of qualitative impacts.
Right. And I don't know if you've ever approached it this way, but that's a really common thing in a content strategy project, is to sit down with a spreadsheet. You go out with Screaming Frog or some other crawler, or you take a site inventory just with your sitemap from your WordPress site or whatever. And then you start adding columns to this big table. And among them can be like, quantitative, you can measure, sales results from calls to action or whatever. But a common one is like some kind of qualitative thing, like how much engagement did this get, how many, that kind of thing. So was that sort of the impetus for Mori, or was that just like you said, it was more like for your annual report to your funders at the nonprofit?
Yeah, and this is actually where I think journalists can be a lot smarter and apply more of the traditional content strategy work to what we're doing. With Mori, it was very much about just how can we not be working only in spreadsheets and have this big mess of things at the end of the year to sift through when we put together these final grant reports. I do think we're starting to take that now. It's funny how money really changes things when you start trying to figure out, right, the cost of things, the benefits, the profits and revenues. And right now at Whereby Us, we're trying to take that to the next level. So we do sponsored projects for clients, and part of what we're trying to figure out is how to set our pricing so that we are using a certain percentage of those budgets on promotion, and then using a certain percentage, obviously, to like our bottom line, and then figuring out how much, right, like exactly what you're talking about, exactly how much a client is paying for the kind of impact that they're trying to get at.
Right.
So once you start having those kinds of conversations, you start looking at things much more down to dollars and cents, and that's part of what we're starting to do now.
Yep, it's the ongoing desire to answer that. Like there used to be a truism. I don't know if they still say it in advertising, that ad buyers, media buyers would always say, "I know I'm wasting half of my ad budget. I just don't know which half." And so they've been trying to and as soon as the promise of the web has always been the quantitative measure that you talk about, but everybody realizes and recognizes and gets that those qualitative measures are equally important. That, like you said, the story isn't complete until you consider those. So that's, and I guess, do you have any, besides Mori and the stuff you're doing at the Evergrade, do you have any other favorite tools for measuring impact that you've come across? Or
we're using Sprout right now as a social scheduling and measurement tool. That's been pretty good. Our COO, Rebecca Monson at Whereby Us, built some really cool tables that kind of aggregate data across our websites and MailChimp as well. So she's been able to pull those all into charts. And I believe she made that with some tool in Google. I'm not super familiar with it. The leaf pivot tables. But those are the things we're using right now. And then, a more organizational measurement tool or process that we're using right now is OKRs.
Objectives and key results for people who don't know.
Yeah, and so we're tracking those in a spreadsheet every week, and that's not directly tied to our editorial strategy, but it's very much tied to like our organizational goals, and I found that to be super useful for just prioritizing what to work on every week and what kind of impact each of those projects is having.
Right. Yeah, and you've mentioned several tech tools. I'm curious about the tech infrastructure there. And one of the reasons I ask is, I can't remember if you or Monica were there, but the Skim co-founders were here in Seattle a couple of years ago, something like that. And as they talked, I was just astonished at the amount of tech that they were like a startup. They had like 4 or 5 editorial people and 20 coders. I was like, wow, that's a machine. What's your? You don't have to. I don't want to violate any proprietary stuff, but what's the ratio of like tech people to content people to journalists at the Evergrey and Whereby?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something that we think about a lot. And actually, if you go to the Whereby Us page, we call ourselves a media and tech company because we think that we have to be living at the intersection of both things, right? We have right now one storytelling producer in Miami and in Seattle. Once our new cities reach a certain level of growth, we'll continue to hire and increase that capacity on our storytelling team. Our tech team right now has a group of people, probably to count 4 or 5 people right now. But they could use like 20 more tomorrow, honestly, because they're working on so many different projects right now. It's incredible. And, we, as much as like, I'm always so eager to like work with them on some of the storytelling stuff we want to do, but they're inundated. They've got so much going on. So they've been working on a referral tool, which has been super cool as a way of bringing in more subscribers. And they've also been working on a promotions tool. So something that automatically pulls in ads into our newsletters. So any client can come into the website, submit their copy, and it automatically gets pulled in to a promotions calendar that gets fed into our newsletters. We use MailChimp as our client, but they've built a whole back end for us in WordPress as like an email template. So we're using that every day, which makes the process so much smoother and more simple. And then they're doing just a lot of stuff around helping us track metrics right now. So I actually just got off a call with our growth editor who we hired a couple months ago, and she's been awesome in working on all of these projects, trying to figure out, the cost of acquiring a new user, basically, and how much that costs doing it through social versus doing it through our website versus doing it through partnerships versus doing it through events. And so the tech team's been working with her to pull in and automate some of that data into the Airtable spreadsheets that I was talking about earlier. So there's a lot going on, and I think, as much as I'm excited about our editorial strategy, I'm also really excited about all the things we're doing around technology, because I think because we prioritize reader engagement and reader relationships, we're thinking really creatively about what we can do with technology to enhance that specifically.
Right. And that'll be an ongoing thing. You mentioned just a minute ago, so it sounds like you use WordPress as your content management system, and with several custom plugins. And that's kind of like how anybody's doing a startup now. Like they just use WordPress because it's such a great platform, and you just open it up and get going. But did you deliberate much on your choice of the content management system, or was there something already in place, or how did you choose on how to manage things that way?
The Nootropic had already been using WordPress when we came on board to launch the Evergrey. So if there was any deliberations to begin with, it would have happened before my time. But I do know that it's enabled us to build a lot of customization on top of a platform that's really intuitive for anybody to use. So it's been kind of a no-brainer for us to stick with that for now.
Yeah, that's how. Yeah, I'm a WordPress person, so but they just hit 30% market share this last week. So a lot of other people have found exactly, and you just articulated it exactly. It's a intuitive platform that is easily expandable, and there you go. Take over the web. So, hey, I just noticed we're getting close to 30 minutes. But I always leave room at the end and there's a ton of other stuff I'd love to talk with you about, but I like to keep the episodes kind of consumable for a nice car commute. But I wanted to give you the opportunity. Is there anything about that you've discovered about content strategy or about the evolution of journalism, or anything that you'd like to share with my listeners or our listeners?
Yeah. There's so much. You totally gave me a heads up that you were going to ask this, and now I don't even know what to choose from. I'd say one, I always think it's really helpful in these interviews to share challenges and struggles. I never really want to hear about like people's great successes, because I don't know, unless they're really good at like pulling out lessons learned and like what you can do with them. I'd say a challenge that we've come up against is figuring out the right balance between project-based work and daily work. So, one thing that we wanted to do early on was put out a good amount of content, but not fall into the daily blogger sort of mentality, right? I think that there's certainly value in that somewhere, but there is so much content online these days, and people are just overloaded. So we wanted to make sure we were being really thoughtful in the time we were taking to create things for people, right? So we didn't want to fall into that like daily blogger sort of mentality, but at the same time, we needed to be putting stuff out on a regular basis. So that's what our newsletter is. But the newsletter also isn't necessarily like an article a day, right? We have the aggregates in there, as you know. We have a little intro and an outro, and we have a photo. And so we had a lot of conversations. I guess this is really nerdy, but we had a lot of conversations about what makes the newsletter substantial enough, right, to be sent out every day. Can we just do aggregates and like a little intro and say goodbye? Is that enough? Do we need to have some sort of original piece of content every single day? And, we still talk about that a lot. We're still trying to get to like a good place on what it means for something to be an original. But where we've currently landed is, it's a piece of content that contains our own original storytelling or commentary or analysis or experience. So it's not a retweet. It's not just a Facebook post of something else somebody else has shared. It's not just sharing back your feedback either. There has to be some sort of value add that we're bringing to the table. And I bring that up because, I think it's easy to get into this rhythm of like, we got to put something new out all the time. We got to keep the churn going. But we've really tried to push back against that and figure out what does that mean exactly to put something new out every day? Like what qualifies as that in terms of what's most valuable to the user. So
you really have
thoughts on that. I'm always happy to talk more about it because I think it's a really interesting, nerdy thing to dig into.
No, you've got me thinking about that because it kind of gets at like, capturing attention is so difficult nowadays. And you talked earlier about how experimental and iterative you are. And so I can see lessons coming out of that. But I'm wondering, like, how would you measure if indeed your success is attributable to the variety? That you have this consistent brand, but you kind of do something a little bit different. And I noticed this and I appreciate this. I read the Evergrey every day. And I noticed that and appreciate it. And I'm kind of like, it's kind of a meta experience for me because I'm kind of reading it like a content strategist going, well, that's interesting. They're not doing the exact same thing, but you kind of know it's them. And I don't know. Yeah. Any insights so far from that approach and that kind of inquiry?
I mean, like I alluded to this, but we thought, okay, we're going to put the newsletter out every day, have something in there. But then we're really going to focus all of our value add on projects. We're going to go all in on projects. And, we did this series on native transplant videos. We did a series on natives and transplants as videos a few months ago that did really well for us. And we were like, okay, we just need to do more of these series and more of projects. It hasn't been as successful as we wanted it to be because it's much slower. The pace is a lot slower. And part of what we want to communicate to our users is that we have our finger on the pulse of the community in the city. So we don't want to go quite as far as like only doing project-based stuff. So right now what we're trying to figure out is just where is that middle ground of putting something original out every day and also making sure that it's valuable in some way to the users.
Right. Well, that's an interesting, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you specifically about this is that you are a new kind of journalism, and that insight that you're gathering there is like, maybe this is how journalism works in the future. Anyhow, yeah, it's super fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Anika. This has been a really great conversation, and about 10 things I want to follow up on. So maybe we'll do this again in a few months.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Larry. This has been great. I appreciate it.
Great. Have a good one. Ciao.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another content strategy interview.